In basic terms, when you take a picture, we often refer to it as an exposure. So, in simple terms, we determine how much light and for how long that light reaches the camera's sensor, which captures what we know to be a photograph. So, think of an exposure as we're literally exposing the camera's sensor to a specific amount of light through a lens for a period of time for a desired outcome. So exposure is determined by three things. You've probably heard them before: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. I'm going to explain exposure by likening it to our eyes. An aperture of a camera is the pupil of the eye, the black part, which is the opening at the center of the iris, of course, the colored part of the eye, through which light passes. Now, the iris adjusts the size of the pupil to control the amount of light that enters the eye. So when you hear about one's pupils, say, being dilated, it means the pupil, the black center of the eye, is large, allowing more light to travel into it. You'll often notice this when it's dark, perhaps looking into a mirror and you can see that the pupils are dilated, or perhaps when you've taken a questionable substance. Now, in a bright environment, your pupils are smaller because we have plenty of light. So, if you look at this lens I'm adjusting, the aperture, which are the internal blades of a lens, controls how much light enters through it, which is exactly like our eyes. Shutter speed is like the time between closing our eyes and opening them. Think of it like the time between blinks, for example. We're determining for how long is that light going to travel through the pupils, which of course is like shutter speed. Now, ISO is the camera's sensitivity to light. So if we continue our analogy of the human eye, ISO can be likened to perhaps maybe like the older we get, the less details we see. The younger we are, the more detail we see. Although we're going to demonstrate the following concepts practically with real people on location, it's important to do an overview of what is known as the exposure triangle. Take a look at this diagram and how the three elements that determine exposure, including aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, and what happens when you adjust these settings of each of these and how they relate to each other. So remember, the aperture controls the amount of light we allow on the camera's sensor and how much is in focus. We refer to what is in focus as depth of field, and the settings are referenced as f-stops. Now, it's not important to understand what the science of what the f in f-stop means, but more importantly, how different f-stops relate to your photographs. So if you look at the exposure triangle, and we're focusing now on aperture. These are sort of typical aperture settings, and yes, you can have less settings here or lower numbers and higher numbers. For the purpose of this part of the course is we're just going to focus on this, so f2 to f22. Now you'll understand this as we demonstrate these concepts practically, but this is the opening of that pupil that we were discussing. So as we go to f2, there are less things in focus. We need less light so we can shoot in a darker situation or things like that. And this is known as a wide or large aperture. And then as we close the hole, so to speak, it's almost counterintuitive where the numbers go higher. But as we go higher, more things are in focus. It needs more light because we're having more things in focus. So for example, it might be the full sun, or we might be shooting with a speed light or a strobe, but this is known as a narrow or small aperture. So remember, the aperture controls the amount of light on the camera's sensor and how much is in focus, known as depth of field. The shutter speed relates to how much time we allow the light to travel through the lens's aperture and hit the camera's sensor. So now let's look at the exposure triangle, specifically the shutter speed. Now, there are so many shutter speeds in fractions of a second that we could show here, but for the sake of the argument, we're going to cap this at 500th of a second. That's right, If 1 second was divided into 500, 500th of a second, all the way to 1 second. Now, yes, we can go a lot faster and we can go a lot slower, but let's talk about what happens and what you need in this particular situation. So at 500th of a second and faster, we need more light. This will freeze faster moving subjects and objects. Now, we'll talk about safe handheld shutter speeds at a different part of the course. So remember, we're talking about shutter speed, the exposure time of how long the light is traveling through the aperture and hitting the camera's sensor. And at this end of the scale, we need less light, as in if we have a longer exposure, we need less light, and this will blur moving subjects and objects, of course, even without a tripod. So you've got to be careful of that. If you are photographing at a very slow shutter speed, you do need to look at using a tripod. ISO relates to the image sensor's sensitivity to light. The more light you have available, whether it's available light or you had it yourself, like a flash or a continuous light, for example, the lower your ISO setting. The less light you have, the higher the ISO needs to be. So let's talk about the pros and cons of different ISO settings. Now let's look at ISO in the way it relates to the exposure triangle. You can go lower on your ISO and you can go higher depending on the camera. And as before, we're using a limited range just so we can explain the exposure triangle and how everything relates to each other. So remember, ISO is the image sensor's sensitivity to light. Now, as we go higher in the ISO, we need less light, but the payoff is that we have less detail, less sharpness, less dynamic range, and you may have heard of noise or grain. We're going to see more of that as we increase the ISO. As we go lower in the ISO, we need more light. And not so much that we need more light per se, but that's what happens. Like, for example, 100 ISO you'll use in the sun. We're going to have more detail, more sharpness, more dynamic range, as in more information in that file, for example. And we have less noise or grain. A correct exposure can be defined as a photograph that results in your desired outcome. There is no one correct exposure or a catch-all, if you will, as in one combination of aperture, shutter speed, and ISO that is correct. You need to determine what shutter speed you need that will freeze the motion of your subject or object, or maybe perhaps you deliberately want to blur it. You have to work out what f-stop aperture setting you need to use for how many or little of the elements you want in focus. Once you work out those two settings, think of ISO, the camera's sensitivity to light, as how much gas you need to take you to the destination that you basically want. Beyond these three settings, how can a correct exposure be defined? Well, when you photograph a person and light is illuminating the subject, like right here, for example, you want to see detail in the brightest highlight of the face. So when I'm on location and referencing exposing for the face, that's exactly what I mean. Now remember, we're focusing on what a good exposure is, and in future chapters, we'll break down shutter speed, aperture, and ISO properly. Once you determine a correct exposure, liken it to these three glasses of water in front of me. The first glass represents shutter speed, the second is aperture, and the third glass represents ISO. Now we have to assume that in the following example that the amount of light that exists is consistently the same, as in the brightness of light on the subject and the environment do not change. So let's say a correct exposure is, say, 1/250th of a second, the second glass is f8, and the third glass is ISO of 100. If you're photographing fast motion like a dog running towards you, 250th of a second is not fast enough to freeze that dog's motion, so you have to increase the shutter speed. You can't just increase the shutter speed and no other setting with no consequences. If you do, your photo will appear darker and be underexposed. So you need to pour more water into the shutter speed glass. You can only source that water, so to speak, from the other two glasses. Remember, that is if the lighting doesn't change. So in this example, we'll take some water from the aperture glass, and there's give and take, and a compromise that you actually need to make. So let's increase the shutter speed from a 250th of a second to 1,000th of a second. But now we have to go from f8 to f4, and we keep the ISO at 100. So both exposures are technically correct, but one gives you more chance to freeze the dog's motion. Let's say that still wasn't enough, and we had to increase the speed further still. So we now set the shutter speed to 2,000th of a second. And so we can either source that extra water from the aperture glass or the ISO glass. For this example, I'll source the extra water I need from the aperture glass. So again, I use f2.8 and we remain at 100 ISO. And there it is. So now we have an exposure of 2,000th of a second, which freezes the motion, f2.8, which means a shallower depth of field, less things in focus, and 100 ISO, which means we have a great quality image. So what happens when the light changes and the sun is going down? So we need more water, more gas, so to speak. So we have no other choice but to place it in the ISO glass. So let's do that. So we now have an exposure of 2,000th of a second, f2.8 at 1600 ISO, as in the camera's sensitivity to the light. The consequence of that is that we still have a good exposure, but as I increase the ISO, there is more noise or grain, which means the quality isn't as good, but it's necessary to obtain a correct exposure. So now we have an understanding of exposure. In the following chapters, we're going to break it down practically and discuss shutter speed, aperture, and ISO independently. What are the pros and cons when you change these settings? And how does this help us craft an image from scratch? You'll notice that when I'm photographing, I have a bit of a contraption around my camera. So the profile of my camera is just looking a lot more abundant than normal. And this is for teaching purposes. This is for your viewing and educational pleasure. Let me explain what's on the camera so we can get that over and done with, and we can focus on the lessons at hand. So what we've basically got here is my camera. It's the Nikon Z8. I have a cage. It's a small rig cage, often used for filmmaking. You can put different things on it and all that kind of stuff. And then I have a transmitter, a Holyland transmitter that runs from HDMI to HDMI. And what that basically does is it gives me the ability to record my EVF. Now the EVF is my electronic viewfinder. As I put my eye to the camera, what we'll do is cut to the footage of what my camera is seeing. It's the best educational experience because I could be photographing all day long, but I don't know about you, but when I was learning from the beginning, I was like, I wish I could see what the photographer was seeing. And now we have exactly that. So just to remind you, we've got a Nikon Z8 85mm f1.2 for this example. We have a small rig cage running to a Holyland transmitter, goes to HDMI to HDMI. This transmits my EVF signal to a receiver. I've actually cross-threaded the actual receiver. That's why it's in a bag right now. And that runs from HDMI in to my Atomos. This is the sound that basically helps Jason, who's behind this particular camera, to edit my videos so that when I'm actually photographing and you can see this camera and the behind the scenes, we can sync audio very, very easily. And this records my EVF. And it's actually a really cool thing. This and the actual receiver is powered by what we call a V-mount battery. So we're just basically tapping into that power and makes it really easy. So just know that I traditionally wouldn't shoot every single shot on a tripod. It's actually quite limiting. Most of the portraits that I do in the studio are on a tripod, but when I'm photographing a wedding, for example, I want to be a bit more looser. Let's say I'm doing a fashion assignment and I need a bit more freedom, then you will not see this on my camera. You'll just see the camera and I will not be shooting on a tripod. So if you see this, please ignore it because it's usually only used for teaching purposes and or if I'm doing filmmaking. So how do we determine a correct exposure? There are so many ways of doing it. There are different camera modes where you can let the camera do the work, as in do the thinking for you. But the problem is that the camera is not a human. It does not know what you want. So therefore it's going to have a particular average. Without getting into that detail, I want to give you permission to have freedom with your camera and just trust what you see. Because after all, to remind you, we are actually teaching right now with the mirrorless camera. One of the incredible advantages in actually photographing with the mirrorless camera is that you see live exposure. Now, what does that mean? Well, I'm looking in the camera right now, and this is what we consider an underexposed photograph. It's dark. It just doesn't look good. And now, what do we mean by a good exposure? Now, I can give you a scientific term. I can go into all this mathematical science, which will confuse the hell out of you. And I've got to say, from a photographer who's been photographing for 30 years, who used to have a light meter, a manual contraption that you used to have to hold up to the person's face in the direction of light, and it'll give you a readout and put those settings into the camera. I'm telling you, I've done enough of that in my career. I'm going to trust my gut. And what I'm looking for here is simply a good exposure. And what I mean by that is detail in the brightest highlight on the face. So in terms of exposure right now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick 250 speed. Even though that I'm on a tripod, I want a speed that is going to freeze the motion, and we'll discuss shutter speed in more detail shortly. But at the moment, I'm actually looking at her face and looking for detail. And what I do is I just move one of my dials, whether it's a shutter speed, aperture, or ISO, until I get what I believe to be a correct exposure. In layman terms, move one of the dials until it looks good. So let's do that. So I've moved the shutter speed. I've got my desired aperture, which is 2.8. So now I'm just going to move my ISO. Now, sometimes what I do is I just go overboard. You can clearly see that that's what we call overexposed. We're missing detail in the brightest highlight in her face. So what I'm going to do is, as I click down from 800 ISO to 640 to 500 to 400, we call that 3 stop increments. It's one full stop, as in each click is a third of a stop difference, or a third of an ISO. We're halving the ISO. So we were from 800 and we halve that ISO, 3 clicks, and bang, we're at 400. But let's look at her face. I feel like we're missing still some detail in her face. Just trust your gut. Are you seeing good detail in the back of your camera? Now, if I go around about there, do you see how you've got detail in the brightest highlight on her face, on her forehead, on her cheek, on her upper chest? For me, that's a great exposure. Now, there are some photographers, or you may have heard of what a histogram means. A histogram looks like a bit of a mountain, and you might not know, well, what does it mean? What does it have to look like? I'm not going to bore you with that for the moment. I think that should be perhaps taught in a later part of a more advanced course. The idea is that if you approach things too scientifically, then you are not going to get the desired outcome. For example, if I had her face in a pocket of light and everything was dark and dramatic, then the camera would deem that to be a bad exposure. And we'll discuss more of that shortly. For the moment, all I want to do is teach you and help you simplify the whole process and demystify it by simply moving one of those 3 dials that we discussed until it looks good. Now turn this way, turn your face, gorgeous, beautiful, hold it. There we go. Go nice and close. Beautiful detail there. Detail in shadows, detail in highlights. We've got a great exposure. If the light doesn't change, I can use that same exposure from different angles. I can go further away. I'm totally happy. Make it easy for yourself. Trust your gut. Use the benefits of using a mirrorless camera, and make sure you're seeing live exposure. So we've talked about the exposure triangle and how once you determine the correct exposure, there's not just one way of getting your desired outcome. You simply change one of either the shutter speed, the aperture, or the ISO, and you can achieve the exact same shot within reason, depending on if there's movement in the shot, depends on how many things you want in focus, and depends on really how much light you have available. But for the moment, we are shooting just with simple window light coming through. We have Jackson just sitting on a stool there, just sort of resting his face on his hand. And what I'll do now, like what I've got here as a particular exposure, I've got 250th of a second at 2.8 at 250 ISO. Let's take that shot. Okay, so just rest just off a little bit and turn this way. Just there, good. Okay, hold it there for me. Okay. Okay, so we've got an exposure. We've got the shot. Now, we talked about exposure give and take. It means that if I want to increase the speed, I've got to get that extra juice, so to speak, from somewhere. So let's have a look. So we're not really concerned about what a higher shutter speed or a slower shutter speed does at the moment. That's a different part of the course. This is to prove to you that you can actually get the same look just by changing a few of the settings in a different way. But you have to, if you take from one, you have to put in the other. The lighting stays the same, as we discussed earlier in the course, with those glasses of water. So right now, we have the glass filled at 250th of a second, 2.8 at 250. As I increase my speed, see how I've gone 4 clicks. I'm at 640th of a second speed. Then now I need to, 1 second, where was I? 250? 2, 3, 4. That's it. So now I'm shooting 640th of a second at 1.8. Turn your face this way for me, mate. Good, hold it there. So have a look at the shot. I mean, apart from him moving slightly in between shots, it's the same exposure, just different settings. Okay, let's do something else right now. What happens if we wanted a lower ISO? 2, 3, 4. I wanted to shoot with 100 ISO. So what I've done is I've actually decreased my ISO to 100, but you can see it's actually underexposed. I did 4 clicks. So I need to have 4 clicks towards the brighter end so I get the same exposure. So let's do that. There we go. I did it with my speed this time. Take my shot. And again, you see how the lighting really hasn't changed. What happens is the evidence of that lighting can appear different based upon the fact that if I shoot at an f1.2, at a very shallow depth of field, which basically means less things are in focus. So highlights are going to appear a little bit different out of focus than they will be in focus. But that example of taking the same shot with 3 different combinations of shutter speed, aperture, ISO proved to you there is not one correct exposure. In fact, what on paper is a good exposure is not always a good exposure. Now, let's look at what the camera tells us is a good exposure. And let's see if I was close to it by what I actually just like with my own 2 eyes. So I'm looking in the camera right now. Okay, let's have a look. Do you see the camera meter? And then you've got minus and all those little dots there and a 0. Then 0 is the camera telling me that's what I believe to be a good exposure. So as you can see right now, if I move my shutter speed upwards, do you see how those notches are going towards the minus? We're saying each one of those notches is 1/3 increment underexposed by what the camera is saying. Let me go back. So right there, in fact, we happen to have a good exposure. Now, why is that? Well, we've got highlights, we've got his hair that's neither black or white, we've got his denim, that if that was translated into a grayscale from black to white, that would be a little bit grayer. We've got a lighter gray in the background. So when you mix all that in together, the camera believes this to be a good exposure, and it's actually working effectively. But if I was to go closer on his skin, if I was to go further away with negative background, you'll notice that the exposure will change quite dramatically, as in what the camera believes to be a good exposure. So let's do that. So right now, the camera believes that this is a great exposure, and I agree with it. Watch what happens when we go further back. So check that out. What I've basically done is I've just allowed negative space behind him and above him, but the camera is telling me that this is a bad exposure. That's why if you trust the camera and don't think like a human or really cook this to your taste, then you're going to get a bad exposure, and we don't want that.
So my suggestion is that if you are shooting, in fact, on the manual setting, that once you get the light right for the face, whether you go close up or further away or anything like that, keep your setting the same, assuming that the lighting doesn't change. And yes, lighting and shutter speed and different things will affect your background in different ways, but that might be a little bit too advanced to discuss right now. All I'm telling you is you cannot trust the camera for the exposure because, as we just showed you, you include a little bit more negative space, all of a sudden things will change.